Okay, we're moving on still with AC 2.1 and we're still looking at biological theories of criminality. But this time we're going to look at genetic theories and in particular twin and adoption studies. I'm also going to evaluate their effectiveness, which is AC 3.2, and I'm going to start to look at how genetic theories have informed policy development. So, just a reminder once again that biological theories of criminality are basically saying that criminals are biologically different from non-criminals and that it's this difference that causes them to commit crime. We've looked already at physiological theories such as those of Lombroso and Sheldon, but now we're going to look at genetic theories, and that's linked to twin and adoption studies. And we've also got another genetic theory to look at later on in another PowerPoint, which will be dealing with XYY. So this PowerPoint, as I've said, on twin and adoption studies. And genetic theories are basically claiming that criminality is inborn and it's passed down genetically from parent to child. So without further ado, let's go back to what Lombroso said when we looked at physiological theories. He said crime was inborn, it's passed down genetically from parent to child. So if this is the case, then that might explain why crime runs in the family. Now, have we got any evidence for the fact that crime may run in the family? Well, it would appear that we might. So the Cambridge study in delinquent development, and this is a longitudinal study, which means it's been carrying on without end since 1961. And this study here, the Cambridge study, has found that out of 397 families, half of all criminal convictions came in just 23 families. Now this implies to a certain extent that there must be something in the family that is making those people criminal. And biological theories, genetic theories, would point to the gene. Lombroso, now discredited, pointed to facial features. But the key point is, it's the biological theory. It's the idea that something within you is causing you to commit crime. And Osborne and West studied the same data. They extrapolated from the Cambridge study, and they found that sons who had a criminal father were more likely to have a criminal record too, again suggesting there's something within the family. So that's the theory. So how do twin studies support that theory? Well, here's the thinking. So our theory is that crime often runs in families because family members who are blood relatives, so parents, children, siblings, brothers, sisters, share many of the same genes. So that's your biological theory. So therefore, if one member of the family has, for want of a better word, criminal genes, it's likely that their blood relatives will have them too. That is what the biological theory is stating. That's what genetic theories are stating. There's this criminal gene that somehow is passed down within families. How do you test the theory? Well, the answer is you test it by twin studies. So really this part of the course is looking at how twin studies are used to either prove or disprove the genetic theories that crime is passed on through the genes via the family. So let's look at twins in more detail. Identical twins are known as monozygotic twins. Now, use that word, use that technical language, monozygotic, in any exam answer that you give. And identical twins share 100% of the same gene. Effectively, they are clones of each other. They are 100% genetically identical. So there's Jedward, and they are monozygotic, genetically the same. God help them. And we've got non-identical twins, and they are known as dizygotic, and they share 50% of their genes, and that's the Olsen twins, who are non-identical, therefore dizygotic. And basically, if you're a non-identical twins, as we see here, involves 2 sperm cells and 2 eggs, whereas identical twins involve one sperm cell, one egg. The zygote then splits into two and forms two embryos. So monozygotic, one zygote, dizygotic, two zygotes, identical versus non-identical twin. And I've put you a little clip. For those who are watching this on my YouTube channel, you can copy this down and go to this clip. Very good little 5 minutes on how twin studies are used. So it explains it really well if you want to use that. So, researchers into genetic theories use studies of monozygotic twins as a way to test their theory of criminality. And that's because identical or monozygotic twins share exactly the same genes. They're both developing from that same fertilized egg zygote. Therefore, it follows, if our biological theory of genetics is correct, if one twin is criminal, then the other twin ought to be criminal too, because they are genetically identical. So biology is the cause of crime. If your genes are the cause of the crime, in an identical twin, if you've got a criminal identical twin, then the other twin should also be criminal. It's in the genes. So, if one identical twin displays aggressive criminal tendencies and so does the other twin, then the behaviour must be innate. It's got to be due to genetic factors. It's got to be down to nature, if that is the case. And that's the key question here, if it's the case. However, if you've got one identical twin displaying identical and criminal tendencies, but the other twin doesn't, then you've got the argument that the environment may be more responsible for criminality. So what we're looking at here is the nature versus nurture debate. Biological theories are looking at nature. They're saying that nature's the cause of criminality, or there's an element of it within the cause of criminality. So the degree of similarity in twin pairs, when people study this, is measured by what's called a concordance rate. Again, you've got to use that phrase, concordance rate, in any exam answer you give. And all we mean by the concordance rate is the percentage of pairs of twins or other blood relatives who exhibit the same particular trait or disorder. So how high the percentage is. So in other words, the higher the concordance rate, the higher you get the agreement between the twins doing exactly the same thing, the more likely it is that genetics are playing a part in the criminality. High concordance rate backs up the biological theories, the genetic theories. That is what we're saying here. So let's look at some studies. And again, you'll need to be able to cite these in any exam answer. So the one we've chosen here is Christensen, 1977. Christensen studied 3,586 twin pairs in Denmark. And he found that there was a 52% concordance rate between monozygotic twins. What that means is, if one identical twin had a conviction, there was a 52% chance that the other twin would also have a conviction. 52% concordance rate. Whereas among dizygotic twins, remember they are not genetically the same, they don't share 100% of each other's DNA, only 50%, the concordance rate was much, much lower at 22%. So, what does that point to? Well, before we look at that, let's look at another study. Ishikawa and Rain, they had a 44% concordance rate for identical twins and only 21.6 for non-identical twins. So we've got this marked increase of concordance for criminal behaviour among identical twins. And that suggests that identical twins do inherit some biological characteristics that increase their joint risk for criminal involvement. However, and this is the big however, and please ensure you remember this, the fact that the research doesn't show 100% concordance means that it can't be entirely genetic. it points to there being a genetic cause of criminality, a biological cause of criminality, but it's only at 52%, and if it's Ishikawa and Rain, 44%. There's a correlation, there's high concordance, but if it was all genetics, if it was all nature, it would be 100%. It's not. So what this is saying is, yes, there is a genetic cause of criminality, but it's not the only cause. Nature plays a part, but also it suggests nurture must also play a part as well. So to give you some examples of twins who are criminal, I've got 6 or 7 different twins who have shared criminality. So perhaps the most famous twins in Britain, Ronnie and Reggie Kray, boxers turned criminals. They were almost celebrities of their time, took part in lots of gang-related activity, arson, robbery, and they were eventually convicted for murder. Reggie for the murder of Jack the Hat McVitie, Ronnie for George Cornell. But many people think those two murders were linked because Ronnie and Reggie did everything together, including committing crime. So that's Ronnie and Reggie. You can look at them in more detail if you wish. We've got Deo and Charles Tamale, again twins from Edmonton in London. They committed a brutal stabbing during a robbery gone wrong. Both violent criminals, sentenced to 22 years for murder. More details in there if you wish to read it. Or these two are quite interesting. Stephen and Robert Bruce Spahalski, both killers. But what's interesting about these two, each acted alone, unaware of the other identical twins' homicidal tendencies. So that supports your concordance right there. Stephen is quoted as saying, "I thought I was the only murderer in the family," when he was told about his brother confessing to 4 killings. And again, more details in that second paragraph there of exactly what their crimes were. Or you can use Dante and Dante Hall, again twin brothers, attempted to rob a house and mistakenly crashed a party and then opened fire on the guests. Again, the interesting thing about these two was even though they were tried separately, they were the first identical twins to technically be up on trial for with the possibility of being sentenced to death together. But the trial became very messy. One twin's lawyer tried to blame the other twin for being the ringleader. One was found guilty. Dante got the death penalty, Dante 2 life sentences, and then later on Florida law was changed and they were sent back. The death penalty was repealed. Or you can use the Bondurant brothers, and they were twins who killed together and separately as well. They were convicted of murder in 1991, and again some information about them further on this slide if you want to read it. And then you've got Joel and Michael Stovall, very interesting pair. Stovall was arrested for shooting a neighbour's dog. Whilst he was in the back of the police car, his twin brother and family arrived. Twin brother was then arrested, and they then shot the police officer in the back of his car. It involved a 24-hour chase involving multiple robberies, and they were both sentenced ultimately to 896 years with no possibility of parole. So there are your examples of twins that are notorious criminals, which gives you more grist to the mill should you choose to use those as case studies. And that then leads us on to adoption studies. So we've looked at twin studies, so you can see how they can be used to argue that there is a biological cause for crime. But what about adoption studies? Well, they're quite interesting, so let's look at the thinking of those as well. So one of the key criticisms you have into genetic research is that it's very difficult to rule out the effect of environment. For example, you could have a twin study that has a 68% concordance rates between monozygotic twins, but if they're raised in the same home environment, then the chances are that they've been treated in a similar way by their parents and siblings, and therefore the learning environment they grow up in is likely to be a factor in their behaviour. You can't detach the nurture from the nature, but adoption studies can, because they are trying to rule out this idea of being brought up together in the same environment by looking at children who've been adopted and have therefore been raised by different parents where there's no genetic similarity. So researchers have used adoption studies to test for genetic causes of crime. And these studies are comparing adopted children both to their biological birth parents and to their adopted parents. So the thinking behind it is this: if an adopted child, especially one that's adopted soon after birth, shares the same environment as their adoptive parents, but the same genes as their biological parents, if we find that the adoptee's behaviour regarding criminality is more like the birth parents, this would support the idea of nature, the idea of a genetic reason for criminality. If, however, the adopted child's behaviour is more like that of their adopted parents, that suggests nurture. So it suggests there's something else to it. So that's the thinking behind adoption studies. So if we look at these, the big study is Mednick et al. And he followed 14,000 adoptees and found that boys with no criminal parents, either adoptive or biological, had a baseline rate of criminal conviction of 14%. So that's someone who's been adopted, the parents aren't criminal, and neither are the adoptive parents criminal. 14% of criminality. If the adoptive but not the biological parents were criminal, then it was 15%, so roughly the same, okay? But if the biological but not the adoptive parents were criminal, then the rate increased to 20%. So this figure, or these figures, do suggest a link between biology and criminality, which goes with our nature debate. And Mednick also found out that if biological and adoptive parents were criminal, so both were criminal, the rate increased to 25%. That then suggests that environment as well as biology influence criminality. So there's your nurture debate. So let's look at some other examples. We can use the example of Crow in 1972. He compared a group of adopted children whose biological mother had a criminal record to a control group of adopted children whose biological mother didn't have a criminal record. And he found that if the biological mother had a criminal record, 50% of the adopted children also had one by the time they were 18. That's a hell of a statistic, that. So in the control group, only 5% of the adopted children had a criminal record by the time they were 18. So that really does move towards the genetic cause for crime. Okay, so that suggests that regardless of the changed environment, children seemed biologically predisposed to criminality. So let's evaluate. Let's start with twin studies. What are the strengths of twin studies? Well, because monozygotic twins are genetically identical, it's therefore logical to examine whether their offending behaviour is also identical. The research makes perfect sense. That's definitely a strength. And it is clear that twin studies give some support to genetic explanations. Notice I am using the word some here. Ishikawa and Rain had a very high concordance rate for identical over non-identical twins. So it points towards a genetic explanation. That is a strength. However, let's look at the weaknesses. If genes, and I can't stress this enough, and this is what you should be putting in exam papers, if genes were the only cause of criminality, identical twins would show 100% concordance. But studies only show half or less. It doesn't rule out a genetic cause, but what it's saying is it's not the sole cause. Higher concordance rates also between identical twins may be due to sharing the same school, home, family, etc. The shared environment might be the cause of the similarities in the criminal behaviour, not the identical genes being the cause of the criminal behaviour. So the nurture over the nature. To continue with those weaknesses for twin studies, it would be true to say that parents treat identical twins more alike than they do non-identical twins. Also, identical twins may feel closer than non-identical twins do. So one twin may be influenced by the other's criminality to become more criminal too. So these environmental factors may produce similarities in behaviour. That might be the reason behind it. And you could also argue it's impossible to isolate and measure the effect of genes separately from environmental effects. You just can't do it. And also it'd be true to say that in early studies there was no way of knowing for certain if twins were in fact genetically identical, since DNA testing didn't exist then. Okay, so that's twin studies done. So now let's look at the strengths of adoption studies. So the first thing we can say is that adoption studies overcome that problem faced by twin studies, where monozygotic identical twins are brought up in the same household, which therefore makes it impossible to separate the nurture from the nature, the genes from the environment. So it solves that issue. And of course the research design's really logical. In theory, the research allows us to see the relative importance of nature, which would be the genes inherited from the biological parents, versus nurture, which is the environment of the adoptive family. The research is logical, it makes sense. So that's a real strength. And also, the findings of adoption studies give support to genetic explanations. They show that adoptees were more likely to have criminal records if their biological parents had criminal records. So it backs up the genetic biological theory. Weaknesses, however. Well, Godfredson and Hershey argued that adoption studies show genes have little effect on criminality. Adopted children are often placed in environments similar to those of the birth family, with families of the same class and ethnicity in the same locality, etc. And of course, therefore, you can argue that similar environments, nurture, may produce similar behaviour. And of course, many children are not adopted immediately after birth, but remain with their biological family for some time. And this early environment may actually be the true cause of their criminality. So it may not be the genes, it may be that early upbringing. So you can't detach that either. Which moves us on to our last 3 slides, which is looking at AC 4.1, which is how genetic theories have influenced policy development. And we're just going to focus on one particular policy with this, and that is that of eugenics. Now, genetic theories argue that the tendency to commit crime is transmitted by some sort of inherited criminal gene. And the idea that we can identify this criminal gene, and I can't stress this enough, has now been discredited, that it doesn't appear to be a criminal gene. But in the early 20th century, it was associated, this idea that there was this criminal gene was associated with a movement known as eugenics. And eugenicists in the early 20th century were obsessed with the fear that the human race was in danger of degenerating because the poor were breeding at a faster rate than the higher classes. So straight away, it's an extremely elitist policy. And as a result of this, the idea that poor were breeding faster than the higher classes, the poor were passing on supposedly the inferior genes of low intelligence, insanity, poverty and criminality more quickly than the higher classes were passing on their superior genes. So this meant that the average intelligence and moral quality of the population was being lowered. So that's what eugenicists believed. How did that inform policy? Well, One of the things they advocated was compulsory sterilisation. I mean, look at this poster. Only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. So eugenicists argued that the genetically unfit should be prevented from breeding. So they favoured policies such as the compulsory sterilisation of what people they labelled as defectives, such as criminals, since they believe criminality to be hereditary. Those with mental illnesses, those with learning difficulties, were all compulsively sterilised. They set up pressure groups to campaign for their policies. And as a result of this, these policies were introduced in several countries. For example, in 1927, the US Supreme Court ruled that it was legal to compulsorily sterilise the unfit, including those with learning difficulties. And that was for the protection of the health of the nation, of the state. And other eugenic policies have included forced abortions, restrictions on the right to marry. And the ultimate end to eugenics can be found with Hitler and the Nazi Party and their quest for racial purity. The most extreme form of eugenic policies put into place in Nazi Germany. So the Nazis strongly favoured such policy as a means of purifying the Aryan master race by eliminating those they deemed unfit to breed. Here's a poster here which shows the ideal Aryan child compared to a lesser Jewish race. Here you see a man being measured for his facial features to make sure that they fitted in correctly with the so-called racial purity that the Nazis were after. And initially the Nazi Party targeted the physically and mentally disabled, and they compulsorily sterilised 400,000 people against their will and killed 70,000 under their euthanasia policy. And it was this that then spiralled into the justification for the Nazis' genocide of the supposedly inferior races during the Second World War. And that included 6 million Jews, 1.5 million Gypsy and Roma, people of Gypsy and Roma descent. And in addition, lots of others who were defined as deviants were killed, and that included homosexuals, lesbians, drug users, alcoholics, and the homeless. So eugenics, cod science, it had its basis in science, but it's now been completely disproved. There are those that still argue for it, unfortunately, in our society today. Tends to be far right, tends to be extremely racist. A thoroughly unpleasant policy, but nevertheless a policy that was in place in the world within the 20th century. It led to Hitler's quest for racial purity. It led to the compulsory sterilisation of numerous people in America. It led to people not being allowed to marry in America. And that is how some of these policies are influenced by criminological theory. So genetic theory, this idea that in some way it's your genes that cause you to be criminal, cause you to be inferior, influence the policies of nations. And you need to be able to use eugenics as an example of how biological theories have influenced policies in some way. I'll be doing some more of this in my final PowerPoint when I look at Jacobs and XYY. But till then, I hope you've enjoyed it. Goodbye.